During family game night, my stepmom sneered, "You're just the extra kid we tolerate for the tax break." My dad laughed along, and my half-siblings joined in. I didn't react, just waited until midnight to transfer the deed of their vacation home back to my name. By morning, their keys didn't work, and the group chat was on fire. I, 32M, never thought family game night would be the catalyst for burning down 15 years of pretending everything was fine. But sometimes the universe has a twisted sense of timing. The lake house sat in my peripheral vision through the bay window, its lights reflecting off the water like some postcard perfect lie. My grandfather built that house in 1978, and when he died, he left it to me in his will. I was 17. Dad had been furious, but quickly pivoted to negotiation mode. He convinced me the property taxes were too much for a college kid to handle, that maintenance costs would eat me alive, that the family should share it since Grandpa loved all of us. I was young and desperate for Dad's approval after Mom's death 3 years earlier, so I signed the deed over to him with the understanding it was still mine in spirit. That was 15 years ago. Stepmom moved in 6 months after Mom died. The twins came a year later. Dad's new family had been cemented by the time I graduated high school, and I'd been relegated to the role of weekend cameo in their sitcom life. The Monopoly board sprawled across the dining table like a battlefield. Dad rolled the dice with the same aggressive enthusiasm he brought to everything, while stepmom tallied her hotels with manicured fingers. My half-brother and half-sister, both 14 now, scrolled their phones between turns. I'd driven 3 hours for this mandatory monthly gathering, sitting in the same chair I always occupied at the corner of the table, the one closest to the kitchen where I could escape easily. Stepmom landed on my property and threw her hands up in mock frustration. That's when she said it, her voice dripping with performative exasperation about how I always took the game too seriously, how I'd always been difficult about sharing, how I was just the extra kid they tolerated for the tax break anyway. The room went silent for exactly 2 seconds. Then Dad laughed. Not an uncomfortable laugh that tried to diffuse tension. A real laugh, the kind that encouraged more. He added something about how I'd never quite fit into the family dynamic anyway. Always so serious, always keeping score. The twins glanced at each other and giggled, emboldened by their parents. My half-brother made some crack about participation trophies and birth order. I didn't react. I've learned that the best response to cruelty is sometimes no response at all. I placed my rent money in the center of the board, drew a chance card, and continued playing. My face remained neutral, my voice steady when it was my turn to speak. Inside, though, something crystallized. 15 years of swallowed resentment compressed into a single, diamond-hard decision. The game ended around 11. I helped clean up, declined the offer to stay in the guest room like I always did, and drove to the hotel I'd already booked. I never stayed at Dad's house anymore, though they never seemed to notice the pattern. At my laptop in the hotel room, I pulled up the documents I'd been reviewing for the past 6 months. After Grandpa's estate had finally finished probate last year, following some distant cousin's challenge that took forever to resolve, my attorney discovered something interesting. The deed transfer I'd signed at 17 had been contingent on certain conditions that were never met. Dad was supposed to maintain the property in trust for me until I turned 30, then return it. He was supposed to provide annual financial statements. He'd done neither. More importantly, I'd signed as a minor without independent legal counsel, which made the entire transfer voidable. My lawyer had been methodical. We'd quietly filed the paperwork 3 months ago, and the corrected deed had been processed 2 weeks prior. I'd been waiting for the right moment to execute the final step, which required changing the locks and updating the security system I'd had installed last month under the guise of a routine upgrade Dad never questioned. At midnight, I made the calls. The locksmith arrived at the lake house at 1 a.m. The security company updated the access codes remotely. By 2 a.m., the house was completely mine again, legally and physically. I'd arranged everything in advance, waiting only for the right trigger. I didn't sleep. I watched the dawn break over the city skyline from my hotel window, coffee going cold in my hand, phone face down on the desk. The group chat would be erupting soon. The first message came at 7:43 a.m. My half-sister, confused about why the door code wasn't working. Then my half-brother, saying the key wouldn't turn. Stepmom's message arrived at 8:15, asking if I knew anything about the lock situation at the lake house because they'd planned a weekend trip and couldn't get inside. I waited until 9 to respond. I sent a single message to the group chat explaining that the lake house had always been mine legally, that the deed had been corrected to reflect Grandpa's actual wishes, and that they were no longer welcome on the property. I attached a PDF of the deed with my name on it, the legal opinion from my attorney, and a formal trespass notice. My phone exploded. Dad called 17 times in the first hour. I declined every call, letting them roll to voicemail. His messages progressed from confused to angry to threatening. He claimed I'd stolen the house, that I was being vindictive, that family doesn't treat family this way. Stepmom sent a novel-length text about my ingratitude and selfishness. The twins said nothing directly to me, but plenty in the group chat about what a psycho I was. Extended family members I hadn't heard from in years suddenly emerged to offer their opinions. Aunts and uncles weighed in, most defending Dad because that's how family politics work. A few cousins messaged me privately with variations of "about time" and "good for you." Grandpa's brother, my great-uncle who was 86 and gave zero consideration to anyone's feelings, sent a single text saying Grandpa would be proud. I documented everything. Every threat, every message, every voicemail. My attorney was copied on all of it. The weekend came and went. Dad apparently drove to the lake house anyway, tested every door and window, then called the police claiming squatters had taken over his property. The responding officers reviewed my documentation, confirmed the deed was in my name and recently updated through proper legal channels, and informed Dad that he needed to leave. According to the incident report my attorney obtained, Dad had been belligerent enough to nearly get cited for disorderly conduct. By Monday, Dad's lawyer had contacted mine. The conversation was brief. My attorney explained the situation with the detached professionalism of someone who'd anticipated every argument. The transfer I'd signed as a minor was legally voidable. The conditions of the trust were never met. The corrected deed had been properly filed and recorded. There was no case. Dad's lawyer apparently advised him to let it go. He didn't. Update 1. It's been 3 weeks since game night, and the fallout continues to spread like cracks in glass. Dad has escalated from angry calls to full scorched earth mode. He's turned this into his personal crusade, and honestly, I underestimated how far he'd take it. First, he tried the family pressure campaign. He organized an intervention at my aunt's house, ambushing me when I stopped by to drop off her birthday present. 7 family members sat in her living room like some twisted jury, ready to explain why I needed to do the right thing and return the house to Dad. My aunt started with the softer approach, talking about family legacy and keeping peace. Dad jumped in with accusations about my mental state and inability to move past childhood grievances. Stepmom, who had apparently been upgraded to family spokesperson, delivered a rehearsed speech about the memories her children had at that house and how traumatic it was for them to lose access. I let them finish. Then I asked a simple question. Why had nobody mentioned these concerns about family legacy and shared memories during the 15 years when I wasn't invited to use the house I legally owned? Why had Dad rented it out to strangers every summer through a vacation rental service, pocketing the income without ever mentioning it to me? The room went quiet. Apparently, that was a detail Dad had neglected to share with the family council. My uncle asked him if it was true. Dad deflected, saying the rental income went toward maintenance and taxes, which was his right as the property manager. I pulled out my phone and showed them the county tax records I'd obtained. Dad had claimed the property on his taxes, taken deductions, and reported rental income for 12 consecutive years. The maintenance he claimed to have done was minimal at best. I had contractor estimates showing the house needed $40,000 in deferred maintenance that Dad had ignored. The intervention collapsed after that. Half the family members left without saying goodbye to Dad. My aunt apologized to me privately and said she hadn't known the full story. But Dad wasn't done. He filed a lawsuit 2 days after the failed intervention. Breach of oral contract, unjust enrichment, and some other claims my attorney said were borderline frivolous. The lawsuit claimed I'd promised to return the house when I was financially stable, that Dad had invested significant money into improvements, and that the rental income was held in trust for me, but I'd never requested an accounting. All lies, but now I had to defend myself legally. My attorney filed a motion to dismiss, but we also prepared a countersuit. We documented every rental transaction, every dollar Dad had collected, every tax deduction he'd claimed. The numbers were staggering. Over 15 years, Dad had collected roughly $400,000 in rental income from my property. After legitimate expenses for taxes and minimal maintenance, he'd pocketed close to $250,000. My countersuit claimed conversion, breach of fiduciary duty, and fraud. We asked for full restitution plus interest and attorney fees. That changed the dynamic quickly. Dad's attorney scheduled a meeting to discuss settlement. We met at a conference room downtown, everyone on their respective sides of a long table. Dad looked older than I remembered, his anger replaced with something closer to defeat. Stepmom didn't attend. His lawyer opened with an offer. Dad would drop his lawsuit if I dropped mine, and we'd call it even. No money exchanged, everyone walks away. My attorney responded before I could. We had the stronger case by far. We had documentation of income Dad never reported to me, tax returns showing he'd benefited financially, and the original trust conditions he'd violated. If we went to trial, Dad would likely owe me significant money and face potential tax fraud investigations. I watched Dad's face as my attorney laid it out. For a moment, I saw something that might have been regret, but it vanished quickly behind stubborn pride. I made a counteroffer. Dad would drop his lawsuit, sign a document acknowledging he had no claim to the property, and pay me $50,000 to cover my legal fees and a fraction of what he owed. In exchange, I wouldn't pursue the full conversion claim or report the tax discrepancies. Dad's lawyer advised him to take it. Dad refused. He stood up, said I'd regret this, and walked out. So now we're going to trial. My attorney is confident but realistic about the costs and time involved. Meanwhile, the family has fractured into camps. Some relatives have stopped speaking to me entirely. Others have reached out to share their own stories about Dad's financial manipulations over the years. Apparently, I'm not the first family member he's taken advantage of. The twins posted about me on social media, calling me greedy and heartless. Their posts got enough attention that people from high school started reaching out, asking for my side. I haven't responded publicly, but the court of public opinion seems split. What bothers me most isn't the lawsuit or the money. It's the realization that Dad never saw me as his son in the years after Mom died. I was a resource to manage, a problem to solve, an obligation to minimize. The tax break joke wasn't a joke at all. It was the truth, finally spoken out loud. I've started therapy to process all of this. My therapist says I'm grieving the father I thought I had, which is different from the father who actually exists. She's probably right. The lake house sits empty now. I drove up there last weekend, alone, and walked through rooms that smell like my childhood. Grandpa's old fishing rods are still in the garage. The kitchen table where he taught me to play cards is still there, scarred and solid. I sat on the dock and watched the sunset, and for the first time in 15 years, I felt like I was home. Whatever happens with the lawsuit, I'm keeping the house. Not out of spite, though I won't pretend that's not part of it. I'm keeping it because it's mine, because Grandpa wanted me to have it, because I'm done letting Dad rewrite history to suit his narrative. Update 2. The trial never happened. 6 weeks after I posted the last update, 2 days before our court date, Dad's attorney called mine with a capitulation. Dad would drop everything, sign all necessary documents, and pay my legal fees in full. $73,000, which was actually more than my initial settlement offer. What changed? Taxes. My attorney had filed a formal inquiry with the IRS regarding the unreported rental income and suspicious deductions. It was a strategic move, not something we expected to resolve quickly, but it apparently spooked Dad badly enough that his accountant and lawyer both advised immediate settlement. The potential penalties and back taxes Dad faced dwarfed anything my lawsuit could cost him. We signed the settlement agreement in another sterile conference room. Dad wouldn't look at me. He signed each page with sharp, angry movements, then left without saying a word. His attorney stayed behind to handle the final paperwork and mentioned, almost sympathetically, that my father was a proud man who didn't handle being wrong very well. I didn't respond. Pride isn't an excuse for exploitation. The money hit my account a week later. I immediately paid my attorney, set aside funds for the property taxes and maintenance I'd been deferring, and donated $10,000 to a legal aid organization that helps people navigate family property disputes. The rest went into an investment account. But the family situation got worse before it got better. Stepmom filed for divorce 3 months after the settlement. According to my aunt, who heard it from another relative, the IRS inquiry had revealed other financial issues in Dad's business dealings. Dad had apparently been creative with money in multiple areas of his life, and stepmom decided she didn't want to be attached to that liability. The divorce was brutal. Dad had to sell the house they lived in because stepmom was entitled to half its value, and he needed liquidity for the tax settlement. The twins, now 15, blamed me publicly and privately. My half-sister sent me a long email explaining how I destroyed their family, ruined their lives, and stolen their childhood home twice over. The logic was twisted, but her pain was real. I felt bad about that part. They were kids caught in the consequences of their parents' choices. I responded once, briefly, explaining that I'd never wanted any of this, that their father's decisions had created this situation long before game night, and that I hoped someday they'd understand. I also said I'd be open to talking when they were ready, but I understood if that day never came. My half-sister never responded. My half-brother blocked me on everything. Dad moved into a small apartment across town. According to the family grapevine, he's still working but scaled back significantly. Some relatives describe him as broken. Others say he's just finally facing consequences for the first time in his life. I don't know which interpretation is accurate. Maybe both. I haven't spoken to him since the settlement signing. He hasn't tried to reach out either. The lake house became my refuge. I spent most of last summer there, working remotely and fixing the things Dad had neglected. I replaced the rotting deck boards, repainted the exterior, updated the plumbing in the master bathroom. The physical work was therapeutic. Every repair felt like reclaiming something that had been slowly stolen over 15 years. I also invited people Dad had banned from using the property. My mom's side of the family, who Dad had gradually cut out after he remarried, came up for a reunion weekend. Cousins I hadn't seen in a decade brought their kids. We scattered some of Mom's ashes off the dock, which felt right. Grandpa and Mom had been close. They should both be part of that place. My great-uncle visited in September, moving slowly with his walker, but sharp as ever. He sat on the porch and told me stories about Grandpa building the house, how it had been a labor of love and a promise to future generations. He said Grandpa had known Dad was the type to take rather than share, which is why the will had been so specific about leaving the property to me, not to Dad in trust for me. I asked why Grandpa hadn't explained that to me directly when I was younger. My great-uncle said Grandpa died thinking he had more time, that he'd planned to have the conversation when I turned 18, but the heart attack came first. He also said Grandpa would have been furious about what Dad had done and proud of how I'd handled it. That conversation helped more than I expected. Therapy continued. I worked through a lot of anger, grief, and guilt. The guilt was the hardest part. I kept questioning whether I'd overreacted, whether destroying my relationship with Dad and his family was worth a piece of property. My therapist kept reframing it. I hadn't destroyed anything. I'd stopped allowing myself to be exploited and set boundaries that Dad chose not to respect. The destruction was his choice, not mine. 6 months after the settlement, my aunt called with unexpected news. Dad had reached out to her, asking if she thought I'd be willing to meet with him. Not for legal reasons, just to talk. She said he sounded different, less defensive, maybe more aware of what he'd lost. I told her I'd think about it. I thought about it for 3 weeks. Part of me wanted to refuse out of principle. Part of me was curious. Part of me just felt tired of carrying around the weight of it all. I finally agreed to meet at a neutral location, a coffee shop halfway between our cities. I brought my therapist's advice with me like armor. I didn't owe him forgiveness. I didn't need to rebuild anything I didn't want to rebuild, and I could leave at any time. Dad looked smaller than I remembered, grayer, thinner, worn down by the year we'd been through. We sat across from each other with overpriced coffee neither of us drank. He started by apologizing. It wasn't a great apology, too many justifications about stress and financial pressure and not realizing how things had gotten so twisted. But there were moments of genuine acknowledgement. He admitted he'd taken advantage of my grief and youth. He said he'd convinced himself the arrangement was fair because he was managing the property, but he knew that was a rationalization. He said watching his marriage fall apart and losing his kids' respect had forced him to look at patterns he'd been avoiding his whole life. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I asked him a question I'd been carrying since game night. Did he actually see me as just a tax break, or had stepmom's comment been purely cruel? He was quiet for a long time. Then he admitted that after he remarried and the twins were born, he'd started viewing me differently. Not as a burden for tax purposes, but as a reminder of his previous life, of Mom, of obligations that didn't fit his new narrative. He'd emotionally distanced himself and let stepmom set the tone for how I was treated because it was easier than confronting his own guilt about moving on so quickly after mom died. It was the most honest he'd ever been with me. I told him I appreciated the honesty, but I wasn't ready to forgive him. Maybe someday, but not now. The wounds were too fresh, and trust wasn't something he could apologize back into existence. I also told him that if he wanted any relationship moving forward, it would be on my terms and would require consistent effort from him, not just words. He nodded, said he understood, and asked if we could maybe try having coffee again in a few months. I said maybe. We haven't had that coffee yet. It's been 4 months since that first meeting. Dad sends occasional texts, nothing heavy, just checking in. I respond sometimes. It's awkward and stilted, but it's something. The twins are a different story. They haven't reached out, and I haven't pushed. They're still living with their mom, still dealing with their parents' divorce, still angry about everything that happened. I hope they'll eventually understand that their anger is misplaced, but that's not something I can control or rush. I'm dating someone now, which feels significant. She knows the whole story and doesn't think I'm a villain, which helps on the days when I question everything. We spent last weekend at the lake house, and she loved it. Said it felt peaceful, like a place with good bones and a complicated history, but a hopeful future. That's probably the best description I've heard. The house isn't just a property anymore. It's proof that I can set boundaries, that I can stand up for myself even when it costs me, that I don't have to accept mistreatment for the sake of keeping peace. It's also a connection to the people who actually loved me, Grandpa and Mom, and a promise to honor what they wanted for me. I don't regret what I did. Some family members still think I'm heartless. Some think I'm justified. I've stopped caring about the consensus. I did what I needed to do to protect something that was mine. And if that makes me the villain in their story, I can live with that. The lake looks the same as it did when I was a kid. The sunsets still turn the water gold. The fish still bite early in the morning. The dock still creaks under my weight. Some things change, and some things endure. I'm learning to tell the difference.